Hello, and welcome to another episode of AI with Intent. This is a podcast where we focus on providing unfiltered and real world views on our experience of AI in real life based on our real world experience. I'm Sam Braden. I'm your host today. I've been in IT now for about 30 years, both in the UK and Australia, and over that time, I've had a real focus on helping organizations get real value from their investments in IT. I am absolutely delighted to have Ritwik Singh with me today. I've had the absolute pleasure of working with Ritwik now for nearly 15 years in a few guises. He's someone that I've always enjoyed working with because I love the way that he tries to understand what the real problem is that we're trying to solve. Ritwik is the founder of 36 Arc, which is a Sydney-based advisory which helps organizations cut through a lot of the noise around AI and automation to get to the real value. Ritwik's got over 20 years experience in IT, including over 15 years of bigger experience. And amongst many clients that he's worked with would be like CBA, NAB, Optus, and federal government. As well as actually very successfully scaling out a Pega partner for many years as well. Rick really focuses on working with enterprise leaders, helping them separate out getting real operational value from some of the AI hype. So Ritwik, welcome.
Thanks, Sam. Great to be here, and very topical thing that we're going to be chatting about today.
Well, AI is getting a little bit of noise nowadays, isn't it? Just a little bit. So I should just say before we get started that the views we're expressing here are our own personal ones rather than those of the organisations that we work for or with. So moving on to sort of today's topic and to set the scene. Agentic AI has really moved from the conversation around the potential of it and doing pilots and proof concepts, sort of through a number of proof points around whether it does and doesn't actually work, through to more moving to who's actually accountable for the decisions and outcomes that AI makes. So this really means the narrative is sort of turning towards governance and explainable AI. So today's question is, who answers for the agents? So I'd like to start with asking Ritwik, where do you think this conversation actually is, as opposed to perhaps where the marketing is leading people to believe where it is? I think agentic AI has moved quite quickly through a number of sort of distinct phases in an exceptionally short phase of time. And perhaps some of the published material is perhaps lacking on where perhaps the technology is at this moment. So where do you think we are right now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think with agentic AI, everything seems to be agentic. So I would really put it as three phases, and I think you're right that the writing and the narrative behind it really lags it by a fair margin in terms of where we're at and what's being said about it. And I think the first phase was all about potential, right? We all got excited, but we also wanted to know in an enterprise setting, could it even do the thing? Like, could it really achieve what we set out to achieve? And it was all about demoing this capability and some pretty impressive demos. And you can see, hey, look at this thing. It can draft the letter, it can draft your emails, it can summarize documents. And then it started to get a little bit more nuanced than that and answering questions. And I remember there were like pilots everywhere, proof of concepts, a lot of people talking about the impact that's going to have, and a lot of wonder. And I think, based on all of our collective personal experience, we would say that that's pretty fairly earned because it's really arrived a lot faster than most of us expected, I think. I don't think we've seen things happen this quickly. But then the second phase, this is where it all really I think this is where the rubber started hitting the road, and a lot of organizations have been living this in the last year and a half, really. And it's a much harder question that they're trying to answer. It's like, hey, can we actually get this thing to work? And not just in a demo, that is using a very supportive environment to make it work, but in a real life operation, like everyday situations where you've got real customers, real data, and then I think more importantly, real consequences. So this is where how reliable is it really becomes the question. And I think this has turned out to be a much harder question to answer because it's not really a question about the models. Like I think the models are heading towards that level of utility. I think it's starting to become more about, hey, can I rely on this? And that's when we get to this phase, the third phase. And I think this is where we have agentic systems or agentic AI being unleashed to start making decisions. And then we've got that question about who is actually accountable for those decisions. And that is a question that everyone is sort of walking towards. And some people, especially the marketing, does have some answers for it. But I think the first two were all about, hey, can this thing do it? Capability, and then the proof of value. So can it and does it? And I think we've answered those. But the third becomes about governance. I think it's more of a legal question, and it's
Yep.
in some cases it's a question about a specific person's liability, a personal liability, right? So
Yeah.
I think we've moved away from asking what the technology can do and asking who actually answers for it. And I
Yeah.
think they're different questions.
Yeah, look, I would agree, and perhaps before we talk about that third phase that you mentioned, maybe just on the second one. I mean, we've all seen hundreds of demos from in that first phase, and starting to see some in that second phase. But I still feel in some ways organisations getting a little stuck in that second phase. Um, and it's perhaps proved slightly harder to turn a demo into something that's more enterprise ready. Why do you think that might be?
Oh, look, I think, Sam, there's a lot of factors, right? And the old cliche is every organization is going to be different. They're going to have a different context. But that's the reality, is that all the environments are different. Their stack might be different. There's varying levels of complexity, especially in terms of the type of use cases you try and attack with the technology. And then there's the terminology that we all love to use, especially when we're at the start of something, and technical debt. But then the other big one, I think, is data. Like, what is the state of your data? How usable is your data? And how mature are you as an organization to push, pretty disruptive, groundbreaking technology through, and then looking at that whole picture about the change management effects of it as well. So,
Yeah.
and I think, this is where, and I'll come back to that word again. This is where that issue of reliability comes back. The things that you try and solve, they have to do the right thing reliably every time, and regardless of how inputs are messy, how messy the inputs start to get. And then you've got all the edge cases start to come through. So there might be scenarios that you didn't anticipate, and
Yeah.
that's where it starts to come out. So I think what a lot of organizations have found, that there's money being spent, and we'll leave the token economics conversation
Yeah.
to the side
Yep.
right now. But it's you spend all that money, and can the agent do it on its own? I don't think that's enough to get them there. It needs structure,
Yeah.
and it needs to know, it being the agent in this case, it needs to know what it's allowed to do and what it's not allowed to do.
Yeah.
So that when it hands over, to a person, it needs to give some context. It needs to know when to hand off to a person, and then what happens when it's unsure. What are the steps, in what order, and with a record of who did what and why.
Yeah.
So
How do you make sure it doesn't hallucinate and tries to give you the right answer as well? Which,
yeah, and hallucination came out pretty early in the
yeah,
piece when the Gen AI movement
yeah,
started, but there's lots of different technical terms floating around. So RAG,
yeah.
retrieval augmented generation, so to give it facts so that it doesn't
Hmm.
hallucinate, give it more context, and then orchestration. So, for you and I and our backgrounds, when we hear orchestration and workflow, I think we envisage a different world. But across the board, you'll see workflow and orchestration mentioned a lot. But I think this is where, if you kind of boil it down, it's the structure. That's the difference, right, between something that's very clever and looks good and shiny, and then something that you can actually reliably run your business on.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you've got to have the measurable value coming from something that's capable.
Yeah, I'd agree, and that probably leads us quite neatly onto your third phase there, which is really around that sort of accountability. And look, we both worked a lot in financial services, which is regulated by APRA here in Australia. And they actually released effectively an open letter, didn't they, back in April, I think it was, which was really looking at, I suppose, or providing a number of observations around the use of AI and the responsibility and accountability for it in financial services. Um, I mean, I'd be interested in what your take on what that letter was and the sort of why did they send it and what the implications were.
Yeah, like it's pretty interesting for them to actually issue a letter. I mean, regulation is always going to have a bit of a lag, but I think it also helps to kind of just put it into context of why financial services first,
Hmm.
particularly in this country. There's, some of the big banks are quite ahead of the curve in terms of
Yeah.
going with this technology. But I think banking, insurance, super, everything that APRA covers, they're the most heavily regulated.
Yeah.
And they've been making automated, consequential decisions about people for decades, right? We've
Hmm.
we've been involved in some of those technology
Absolutely.
transformations. So everything from how you do your credit risk and assess credit risk, and how you price loans, and how you assess claims,
Hmm.
becomes a pretty significant moment when someone is putting a claim through. And then obviously a very big topic has been fraud and anti-money laundering and everything around that. So I think they're definitely further us down the road, and I think some of the bigger players, some of the big banks are actually quite operationally mature.
Yeah.
But they are watched most closely, and I think if you want to see where the accountability question bites first, that's where you got to look. And this is where APRA, I think, comes into play. So they actually went and did a targeted supervisory review. So they went and
Okay. Yeah.
actually engaged with a whole bunch of banks, the largest banks and insurers, and the super trustees, and they examined how AI is being used inside them. And this was beyond just the polished presentations and the marketing spin. It was, I think,
Yeah.
they started to look at the real risk frameworks that were being put in place and what the accountability chains were. And then at the end of April, they wrote that letter. So, and they wrote to everyone. It's an industry letter, right?
Yeah.
About what they found. And they don't usually do that when things are going well, or if they found things are very rosy. So I think the headline was simple and not surprising. That yeah, it's the adoption is fast. Everyone's excited. Everyone is talking about it and wanting to do it, but the governance around it has not kept up to pace. And I think that exposes institutions to cyber and operational risk. I think the
Yeah.
cyber one gets a lot more airtime, especially with the some of the models that came out and got pulled back and all the stuff that's
Yeah.
happened around it. But I think underneath it all, it's what actually compelled them to write it, and I think it's an accountability gap that is becoming wider and wider.
Yeah.
And I think decisions are increasing to be made or quietly shaped by these systems. And that's what APRA was really looking for: who's accountable for those decisions.
Yeah, and I think they particularly called out the role of the of boards basically, didn't they? In this around, whether they were really sort of stress testing or getting any sort of independent auditing on some of the I suppose products or the vendor promises in some ways of what was being included in the products.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not new for APRA to have this level of scrutiny. And in reading the letter and then also preparing for this podcast, it took me back to when I worked on a pretty massive transformation at CBA a long time ago. 15 or so years ago,
Yeah,
dating myself. It was probably just before we met, actually.
yeah, yeah. I know
But
the project you mean.
yeah, and that was about how the bank priced the big end of town, so their business and institutional loans. So a lot of complexity, a lot of rules, a lot of tech debt, but also a lot of bespoke practices in terms of how the models work. So we took something that was a very slow and very IT dependent process in terms of how the bank was able to make changes to prices,
Hmm.
and also be able to assess loans, and gave the business this capability that they were able to do real time pricing decisions. But it was sitting on pretty complex stuff. So there was a complex credit risk calculation, portfolio simulations, and there was AI in it. And nowadays we have to say old school AI
Yeah,
because there is a distinction. But there was a Moody's risk engine running thousands of Monte Carlo simulations to produce a distribution of outcomes, and that's what was then used. So it wasn't a deterministic calculator, something that you could just plug into Excel. It was probabilistic. It was quite sophisticated, but that model needed validation, and the process to get that model validated before you could unleash it to the bankers was very comprehensive. So to building the technology solution in parallel, we worked with the business to actually do the stress testing of that model, and then they had to put it through an independent audit, get the outcome signed off by internally the risk committee, and also then present that back to the regulator before it went live. So, and that was an ongoing thing. This is like every time you have to make any sort of material changes, you have to keep that process going. So that was a very critical platform, and it got the scrutiny it deserved. But I think this is where this is the catch, right? This is the risk runs the other way now.
Correct, and as you just mentioned, I mean, probabilistic decisioning is actually nothing new. We've been working in that space for, as you say, 15 years or so. The AI brings, an additional complexity because, and we'll probably talk about that around explainability of decisions. But it was interesting though, because I also noticed it wasn't just APRA, but there was actually a whole sort of run of other sort of either people or organisations sort of speaking out about AI and governance. I think there was something about the Chief Justice of New South Wales was also talking about it as well.
Yeah.
So, if that's the case, that's quite important, isn't it? So, I mean, do you want to sort of expand on that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So, timing was APRA came out with their letter, and ASIC had something as well.
They did, yeah.
And that was more aligned to the cybersecurity part. But there was the two regulators, and then this lecture by the Chief Justice of New South Wales. So, I think it's very striking when the Honourable Andrew Bell, Chief Justice of New South Wales, he delivered a lecture, which is the Harold Ford Memorial Lecture. Not something I was completely aware of, I'll admit, until this topic kind of resonated, but it is one of the most prestigious lectures in Australian commercial law, and he actually used the occasion to speak on the individual director's duties in the era of AI.
Right.
So, I think it's something that is a bit of a signal, right? When it tells you how far this thing has traveled. But the argument was that it's about the accountability being the personal in a way that APRA didn't talk about. APRA talked about how the institutions were operating, how the banks and so. But his focus was on the individual director's duty of care. And what sort of protections they rely on in executing their duty when they're making a decision. And his point in plain terms was that the protection only holds if the judgment was actually yours.
Right.
So I think it's the same principle, and it's turning up in real judgments as well, because there is a precedent being set. The Star Entertainment Group went through some civil proceedings, and Justice Lee of the Federal Court made the point directly, because he was sort of saying that AI tools can help directors digest, heaps of information. There's a lot of data that you might need to digest, and I think this applies across all levels. But it can't displace human judgment. That was the call, and there's no substitute for management acting with integrity. So he did cast AI as that amplifier, as something that can help augment, but it can help you comprehend the information better, but it can't replace independent thought. And he was pointed about directors controlling the information they receive, that they cannot use the sheer volume of the board papers as a reason to disengage from it. So I think it's very interesting that if a director simply adopts what an AI system recommended, they've not exercised judgment, they've transcribed it. And that protection that they have falls away. And that's something that Chief Justice Bell did say, that he would want every board member in the country to hear this, that AI produces answers with great confidence and a lot of clarity of language, and maybe a likeness to nefarious actors in our lives, fraudsters. That's what they sound like. So he's basically telling them that you can become fluent. That it's really important to be fluent, but it's not the same thing as being right. And deferring to a confident machine doesn't discharge you from the duty that you personally carry.
Yeah, yeah, I certainly get that. And I think one of the other things APRA also mentioned, talking about boards still, is that I think it commented that perhaps whether the boards had the right skill sets to perhaps challenge some of the vendor presentations. So, we work for the same vendor and other vendors, and everyone has an AI story and has to at the moment because that's what people want to buy. But it's almost quite I suppose almost an uncomfortable thing to say, do the boards have the right capability, sorry, to actually challenge some of the vendors?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we have to be very careful when we talk about this because it's not really trying to be critical of boards per se
Mm.
or vendors. That's not the intention here.
Yeah,
I mean, there are some vendors out there that will just slap AI on their presentations, but you and I, well, as you mentioned, we've been on that vendor side,
yeah,
on the same platform at the same time, and we know all about smoke and mirrors. But I think if there's conviction behind it, like you will make compelling demos. You do want to
yeah,
show the art of possible, but you do also want to have the conviction behind what you're putting out there. And I think you know the education that's needed for boards out there is that it's about this technology, and I think there's that black box aspect, right? When we were pitching to Rabobank back in the day,
yeah,
which was a very successful pitch,
yeah,
there was a lot of sitting with people and actually walking them through, hey, what is this technology capable of? How is it actually going to impact how you do things differently? And it was, it worked. So I think it's a good thing if you're doing things with that level of conviction. And obviously, we have a bit of a bias view that the sector needs more of it, not less.
yeah,
So I think that's what APRA is really trying to point at. It's not trying to say vendors are dishonest. It's trying to say that, hey, there's something more subtle going on here. The technology is actually very powerful, and it starts to become about whether you as the audience are capable enough to understand what's going on,
yeah,
especially in the black box parts. But also you as the vendor presenting this, you might be doing it with all the good intentions, but don't pretend to understand fully how that black box works.
yeah, yeah,
And I think most of us have been using these tools personally for a while now, and we know that we can tweak our prompts and do different things, but we're not necessarily always getting the same answers.
yeah.
And that starts to become how you have to try and treat these things. That they are a self-learning autonomous systems, but they are trying to make decisions in this regulated way. So.
Yeah. So does that sort of move or imply that things such as a control plane, guardrails, AI control towers, are they the sort of answer around this?
Yeah, look, I think from a technology perspective, it's definitely part of the answer.
Yeah,
But I think we have to be careful, especially as people kind of rush towards that it's not the full solution because it's very easy to say, hey, I've got something that oversees, this control tower type of concept, and I can give you an explanation of everything that's happened. So that explainability piece, maybe
easy,
pronunciation
easy to
first.
say that.
Yeah. But with the large language models or the LLMs, it's not necessarily a faithful window if it's reconstructing what it might have done. So it might be, a very plausible explanation after the fact, but I think it's more about traceability. So, what information did the system actually retrieve
Yeah,
as part of that execution? What policy version did it use? You might start to have a proliferation of this sort of stuff happening in your organization as you get these tools that may help you work faster. But what is it also permitted to do? And this is where the constraint starts to come in. And as part of its execution, what tools did it use?
yeah,
And then what recommendation did it make? Which deterministic checks were actually applied? So the human in the loop aspect starts to come into play here as well as to, okay, who approved it, who overrode it, was it allowed to proceed past a certain point,
yeah,
and was the human in the loop just there because they were as a tick box exercise? And there's this whole piece of narrative coming out about humans in the loop having too much to do and then you have this bias towards just approving
Hmm.
what comes across your desk because you just start trusting the system. So I think you need that evidentiary chain that can be interrogated by the humans, the lowly humans, and you can actually defend it. And I think in a regulated setup, that's very important.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, really, sort of saying governance is, or governance tools are very important, but it's only one part of it. The hardest part is, I suppose, almost non-technical in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where you've got to start as an organization. You've got to decide, well, where are we actually prepared to delegate judgment?
Yeah,
And what can our system absorb? Are we ring fencing it? Are we boundary fencing it in a certain way? But you do want to try and get the benefits of the technology as well. Like you don't want it to become a lowest common denominator type of situation where, hey, this doesn't look too different to systems we had a few years ago.
yeah,
So what can it, and this is particularly important for the agentic piece, is what can it execute on its own, and under what conditions must it stop and escalate?
right. So
That's
you've
where that
almost got
whole
a
autonomous piece starts to kick in.
yeah. So you've almost got a deterministic piece, which is like the control, would you say? And then there's the probabilistic piece. How would you sort of expand
Yeah,
on?
and that's what I was just sort of touching on
Yeah,
before, right? Like I've seen some stuff come out in the last 3 to 6 months where there's a narrative forming around, hey, I've got a way to control this AI. So the
yeah,
agentic AI is doing things, and you start looking at it, and it's actually dwindling the benefits of the agentic piece, and it looks very much like workflow and orchestration tools. So I think the objective is deterministic governance of where that probabilistic judgment is actually allowed. Um, a rules engine can
yeah,
calculate and does that robustly. A workflow engine can enforce all those mandatory steps, and then a control plane can constrain those permissions. So the LLMs let them do what they're good at, which is
yeah,
they can interpret that messy reality, they can handle variations, and they can propose or take actions, but doing it within like a bounded operating envelope. And I think none of that removes the accountability. So you can buy the tooling that records what happens. You can buy systems that enforce the boundaries. You can get dashboards that surface that risk up, but you can't buy the person who answers for where that boundary was drawn in the right place
yeah.
and where the resulting decision was one the institution should have made.
Yeah, and I suppose that leads to the whole, and then we've talked about this in other podcasts, but trust. What's organization wants to generate trust in its systems and therefore for its customers, doesn't it? It's not. Trust isn't typically a product capability, is it?
No, exactly. And I think this is going to sound a bit cliched, but trust is an operating model.
Yeah,
And I think it comes from being very explicit about that delegation, and then retaining that evidentiary chain and having that evidence retained in a way that's non-destructible. But also your escalations have to be meaningful. You have to monitor your outcomes, and have a named person who's prepared to actually answer for when the system gets
yeah,
it wrong.
yeah,
Um, so I think the sooner leaders stop, sort of shopping for the shiniest product, they've got to absorb that responsibility for them, and the sooner they'll start actually focusing on the actual work.
makes sense. So, in your opinion, are there organisations or places where you think they're actually starting to adopt this? Adopt this sort of control in a meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the leading organisations, particularly some of the banks
Mm.
in Australia, are definitely at the cutting edge from a governance perspective.
Yep.
But I think taking an industry-wide perspective, the most detailed work I've seen has come out of Singapore so
Okay.
far, and I think that's worth noting. They're trying to be very deliberate about not being anti-innovation with their approach. So it's not that they're actually saying, hey, these are hard and fast rules and these are regulations you have to follow. They're giving you a governance framework. And in the last sort of week or so, there's been stuff that's come out of the UK on a sovereign AI model
Okay.
capability that the banks are looking to sign up to. And then India's talked about how they're going to try and have that accountability and transparency with AI, but that seems more like, hey, we're going to mandate some rules. But the Singapore approach, I think it does a few things that I think make it work really well. And the first thing that they really talked about is don't try and supervise every decision. I think this comes down to how you start to, um, you know, why are you trying to automate in the first place, and don't try and defeat that reason. So you don't want a human in the loop at every little point of your process.
Yeah.
And that touches on what I mentioned before. When you have a human in the loop and suddenly they're getting this huge volume of stuff, they just become rubber stampers. Then they have this automation bias about what the machine is doing and rely on the machine, and they just stamp it. So that's not going to be effective. But you start to identify the moments that really start to matter. What are those significant decision points, and have the human approve before the system actually acts on those points. I think this is all about establishing a tiering of your autonomy scale, a risk tier as to, hey, what are the things that are going to be high risk, significant versus low risk. So that's part of their framework. I think the second move from the Singapore framework perspective is that they name the thing that quietly undoes all of this. So I talked about that automation bias. That is the human tendency to overtrust a system that, and you overtrust it precisely because it has been reliable in the past.
Yeah.
And the better these things get, the more we'll defer to them, and the more we'll trust them. And that deference is exactly how that judgment leaks off the process without anyone ever deciding that it should. So I think the third thing that they've done, and this one probably matters the most, is that their framework states plainly that governing these systems requires clear lines of responsibility. And I think that's coming back to what we were just talking about before, right? So you want human oversight across the whole process, and not just as a kill switch, not just safety features built into the model itself. Like you want to solve it in a way that the organization is set up to answer for what the tool does. So it's a framework that they're proposing. It's not law, and they keep refining it, which is they've actually released some stuff very recently as well. But I think they're trying to stick to their goals where they don't want to inhibit innovation. They want you to be able to use this technology, but it's an honest attempt to answer the question of how, rather than just insisting that someone should.
Yeah. Okay. I'm slightly conscious of time. We're sort of getting towards the end of our slot. So I suppose the question is for me, or not for me, for you, Ritwik, which is, if I'm an enterprise leader, what would I do on a next Monday morning? So what should my responsibilities be to move this forward?
It's ideal we're recording this on Friday, so hopefully we'll get that. No, look, I think it's an old-fashioned take, right? I think it comes back to knowing your why and your what before you touch the how. Now, what outcome are you actually trying to produce, and the why, and stated in terms that a person can be held to. I think that's the crux of all this, because once you're clear on that, two requirements follow, and they're the two I would hold any agentic system to. Number one, it has to be traceable, meaning you can reconstruct what it actually did, what it drew on, what it was permitted to do, and which checks ran and who signed off. And it has to be reliable, meaning it gets there by a process you can repeat and defend, rather than by something closer to instinct that happens to have been right so far, particularly in those sort of very happy path use cases.
Yeah.
But if you get those two, if you get the traceability and the reliability going, and you're sitting on top of a very clear outcome as to what you're trying to achieve, I think that's where the technology starts to become very useful. If you kind of skip them or fast forward them or gloss over them, you will end up in that scenario of having automated decisions that no one can explain, and having that unpredictability of things that happen out there. And that starts to become a very dangerous path. Yeah.
Well, listen, Ritwik, thank you very much as always. Really enjoyed that conversation. A couple of things for me that you sort of touched on earlier, which I think is very important, is that sort of deterministic governance of basically of where probabilistic judgment should be allowed, and how that actually flows up to the board, both as an individual and a corporate responsibility. So I just want to say thank you very much for your time. Always good to chat to you, my friend, and I'll buy you a beer soon. How does that sound?
Sounds good, Sam. Thanks. Great chatting.
Cheers.